In the grey throat of London, where the Thames rolled thick with commerce and coal smoke hung like a shroud over the counting houses of Lombard Street, there existed a power that monarchs acknowledged with deference and ministers consulted in whispers. It was not the power of armies, though armies marched at its pleasure. It was not the power of parliaments, though parliamentarians sought its favour. It was the power of credit, that most ethereal and absolute of authorities, and in the early decades of the 19th century, no name commanded credit with greater assurance than Baring. While emperors rose and fell across the convulsed landscape of Europe, while Napoleon's ambitions shattered against the combined weight of coalition armies, and while the map of the continent was redrawn in blood and treaty ink, the House of Baring stood as immovable as the stones of the Bank of England itself, a private institution that had somehow achieved the gravitas of a sovereign state. The Duc de Richelieu, that shrewd observer of power's true mechanisms, once remarked that there were 6 great powers in Europe: England, France, Prussia, Austria, Russia, and Baring Brothers. It was not said in jest. The origins of this extraordinary ascendancy lay not in aristocratic lineage or inherited title, but in the patient accumulation of capital and reputation across 3 generations of calculated restraint. Sir Francis Baring, the architect of the family's transformation from prosperous merchants to financial titans, understood what so many of his ambitious contemporaries did not: that in the City of London ostentation was the mark of the parvenu, while true power announced itself through silence. Born in 1740 to a family of Lutheran merchants who had found refuge in England from the religious tumult of the continent, Francis Baring inherited a comfortable trade in German wool and linens, the sort of respectable commerce that might sustain a family in moderate prosperity for generations. But Francis possessed that rare combination of mathematical genius and psychological insight that transforms merchants into merchant princes. He saw that the wool trade, profitable though it was, represented merely the foundation upon which something far grander might be constructed. The fleece of sheep could clothe bodies, the manipulation of credit could command nations. The London into which Francis Baring inserted himself as a force to be reckoned with was a city of profound contrasts, a metropolis that somehow contained both the elegant squares of Mayfair and the fetid rookeries of Seven Dials, where wealth and squalor existed in such proximity that a gentleman might pass from one realm to the other in the span of 3 streets. But it was in the square mile of the city proper, that ancient warren of narrow lanes and sudden courtyards, that the true business of empire transpired. Here, behind facades of Portland stone and doors of polished oak, in offices where clerks laboured over ledgers by candlelight, even at midday, because the buildings were pressed so close together that sunshine was a stranger, the credit of nations was extended or withdrawn, the fate of distant ventures decided, and fortunes made or unmade with the scratch of a pen. The fog that rolled in from the Thames on autumn mornings seemed to carry with it the weight of accumulation itself, as if the very air was saturated with the detritus of commerce, the exhalations of counting-houses, the breath of a city grown rich on trade that stretched to every navigable water on earth. Francis Baring's genius lay in recognizing that the future of British commerce rested not in goods, but in the invisible architecture of finance. While other merchants concerned themselves with cargoes and warehouses, Baring perceived that the truly transformative opportunity lay in providing the credit that made such trade possible. He became an acceptance house, a term that sounds almost quaint until one understands its meaning. Baring Brothers would guarantee payment on bills of exchange, lending their unimpeachable credit to merchants who wished to trade across oceans and continents. For a fee, naturally, and a handsome one. But the fee was merely the visible portion of the benefit. The real advantage lay in the intelligence such transactions provided, the comprehensive view of global trade that came from financing ventures from Canton to Calcutta, from Boston to Buenos Aires. Where goods flowed, information followed, and information was the sinew of profitable speculation. By the time of his death in 1810, Francis Baring had transformed a wool merchant's counting house into something unprecedented, a private bank whose credit was considered more reliable than that of most European sovereigns. The physical presence of Baring Brothers on Bishopsgate spoke volumes about the family's understanding of power's proper presentation. The building was not grand in the manner of a palace, nor did it announce itself with vulgar ostentation. It was a structure of quiet certainty, 4 stories of sober grey stone with windows that reflected nothing back to the street, giving the impression of depth without revelation. The iron gates that guarded its entrance were wrought with such precision that they might have been assembled by watchmakers, each scroll and flourish speaking to an attention to detail that was both aesthetic and metaphorical. Behind these gates, in offices panelled in dark wood that seemed to absorb rather than reflect light, the partners of the firm conducted their business with a discretion that amounted almost to secrecy. No brass plate advertised their services, no clerks loitered on the steps touting for custom. Those who had business with Baring Brothers knew where to find them, and those who did not were not encouraged to inquire. This atmosphere of studied restraint extended to the family itself. Unlike the first generation of industrial magnates who would emerge later in the century, men who built Gothic fantasies in the countryside and married their daughters to impoverished lords with the aggressive enthusiasm of social climbers, the Barings understood that true acceptance by the British establishment required the appearance of never having sought it. They purchased estates, certainly, but estates that had belonged to gentry fallen on hard times, not those seized from the wreckage of ancient noble houses. They educated their sons at Winchester and Oxford, ensuring they spoke with the accent and assumptions of the ruling class. They married judiciously, forming alliances with families whose names appeared in Burke's peerage, but whose fortunes required the transfusion of commercial blood. Within 2 generations, the Barings were indistinguishable from the aristocracy they had so carefully infiltrated, except in one crucial respect. They possessed something most aristocrats conspicuously lacked, which was money in quantities sufficient to influence the fate of nations. The nature of merchant banking as practiced by the House of Baring was fundamentally different from the retail banking that served shopkeepers and manufacturers. Baring Brothers did not concern itself with the deposits of tradesmen or the modest loans that built factories. Its clients were governments, and its business was sovereign debt. When the British government needed to finance its war against Napoleon, it was to Baring Brothers that the Chancellor of the Exchequer turned. When the newly independent nations of Latin America sought to establish their credit in European markets, they came to Bishopsgate. When the United States government required financing for the Louisiana Purchase, that extraordinary transaction that doubled the territory of the young republic, it was Baring Brothers that arranged the complex series of bills and transfers that made it possible. These were not transactions that could be conducted in any conventional sense. They required an understanding of international law, currency exchange, sovereign risk, and the intricate web of relationships that constituted European finance. They required, above all, trust, and trust was the commodity in which the Barings dealt most profitably. The social architecture of this trust was elaborate and invisible. At the partners' desks in Bishopsgate, correspondence arrived daily from a network that spanned continents. Brothers and cousins managed offices in Liverpool, in Amsterdam, in Boston. Trusted agents reported from Buenos Aires, from St. Petersburg, from Constantinople. But the most important relationships were cultivated not through correspondence, but through the subtle mechanisms of London society. The Barings dined with ministers and breakfasted with ambassadors. They maintained boxes at the opera and memberships in clubs where cabinet decisions were discussed over port before they were announced in Parliament. They knew which lords were in debt and which heiresses were to come into their inheritances. This intelligence was never used crudely, never deployed in the aggressive manner that might mark them as outsiders. Rather, it informed a pattern of lending and investment so perfectly calibrated to the needs and assumptions of the British ruling class that the Barings became indispensable to its functioning. They were, in the most precise sense, the establishment. It is instructive to consider the contrast with the Rothschilds, that other great dynasty of 19th century finance, whose rise paralleled that of the Barings, but whose methods and position differed in revealing ways. The Rothschilds, spreading from their Frankfurt origins to establish houses in London, Paris, Vienna, Naples and Frankfurt, operated with a speed and aggressiveness that contemporaries found both admirable and unsettling. They were masters of arbitrage, exploiting price differences between markets with a network of couriers and carrier pigeons that gave them information advantages measured in hours and days. They financed governments, certainly, but they did so with terms that reflected their outsider status, demanding collateral and protections that established houses like Baring considered ungentlemanly. Nathan Rothschild, the Napoleon of finance as he was sometimes called, operated from his position on the floor of the London Stock Exchange with the focused intensity of a general commanding troops, buying and selling, making and breaking fortunes, with decisions rendered in seconds. The Rothschilds were brilliant, ruthless, and spectacularly successful. They were also Jewish, and in the profoundly anti-Semitic world of early 19th century European society, this meant they would always be regarded as outsiders, no matter how vast their fortune or how crucial their services. The Barings, by contrast, were Christians who worshipped at respectable Anglican churches, who owned pews passed down through generations, and whose charitable contributions went to causes that reinforced rather than challenged the social order. They were members of Parliament, not because they needed the political power, but because it was what men of their station did. They endowed schools and hospitals, sat on the boards of cultural institutions, and contributed to subscription drives for monuments to national heroes. Where the Rothschilds were cosmopolitan, comfortable in any European capital, speaking multiple languages and maintaining loyalties that transcended national boundaries, the Barings were English in the most complete sense. They might have offices abroad and conduct business across oceans, but their identity was anchored in the peculiar soil of British presumption, that unshakable conviction of civilizational superiority that characterized the imperial mindset. This made them trusted in ways that even the most successful Jewish banking house could never quite achieve. When the British government needed discretion, when transactions required absolute confidentiality, when the full faith and credit of the empire needed to be deployed in ways that could never be disclosed to Parliament or public, it was to Baring Brothers that ministers turned. The mechanism of merchant banking as practiced at the highest level was an art as much as a science. Consider the process by which a sovereign borrower might raise funds in the London market. A representative, perhaps a minister of finance or an authorized agent, would call at Bishopsgate. The initial conversations would be conducted with a delicacy that masked calculations of extraordinary complexity. The borrower's creditworthiness had to be assessed not merely through examination of accounts, which in many cases were rudimentary or unreliable, but through analysis of political stability, resource endowments, trade patterns, and the character of the governing regime. A revolution might be brewing in the provinces. A rival power might be preparing an invasion. The price of the nation's principal export might be poised to collapse. All of this had to be weighed, factored into the terms, reflected in the discount at which bonds would be issued. Then came the question of security. Some nations could offer specific revenues, perhaps customs duties or mining concessions. Others could provide nothing more than their promise to pay. The interest rate would be determined, the maturity date set, the schedule of repayments established. If terms could be agreed, Baring Brothers would then underwrite the loan, purchasing the bonds from the issuing government and assuming the risk of placing them with investors. This was the moment of greatest exposure, when the firm's capital stood behind instruments that might or might not find buyers. The Barings' reputation ensured that their issues were typically oversubscribed, with investors from across Europe eager to purchase bonds guaranteed by the house on Bishopsgate. The fees for arranging such transactions were substantial, often running to several % of the total issue. On a loan of several £1 million, this meant profits that could sustain the firm and its partners in considerable luxury. But the real benefit, as with Francis Baring's acceptance business, was the relationship. A government that borrowed through Baring Brothers would likely return for subsequent issues. It would consult the firm on financial policy. It might grant commercial concessions to British merchants, knowing that such favours would be noted and appreciated on Bishopsgate. In this way, the business of banking became indistinguishable from the business of empire, and the House of Baring became an instrument of British influence as effective as the Royal Navy. The transaction that would come to define the peculiar relationship between European capital and American ambition began not in a banking house, but in the corridors of the Tuileries Palace, where Napoleon Bonaparte, that restless genius of warfare and statecraft, confronted a problem that could not be solved through military brilliance. His dreams of a renewed French empire in the Americas, anchored by the vast Louisiana territory stretching from the Mississippi to the Rockies, had collided with the twin realities of imminent war with Britain and the catastrophic collapse of French power in Saint-Domingue, where enslaved people had achieved what no European army could suppress. The territory was indefensible, the colonial project untenable, and Napoleon needed money for the European campaigns that consumed his imagination. In the spring of 1803, his foreign minister, Talleyrand, that consummate survivor of revolutionary upheaval, made an extraordinary offer to the American envoys in Paris. France would sell the entire Louisiana territory for $15 million, a sum so vast that it exceeded the young republic's annual revenue, and so unexpected that the American negotiators, empowered only to discuss the purchase of New Orleans, found themselves confronting the opportunity to double their nation's territory through a single transaction. The problem, of course, was that the United States government did not possess $15 million, nor anything approaching that sum. The federal treasury operated on resources that would have seemed modest to a middling German principality. Congress would need to authorize the expenditure, bonds would need to be issued, and purchasers for those bonds would need to be found in European capital markets. This was precisely the sort of challenge that separated competent merchants from the princes of international finance. President Jefferson, despite his famous antipathy toward banks and his suspicion of concentrated financial power, understood that American credit alone could not support such a transaction. The bonds of the United States, issued by a government barely 2 decades old, a republic that had already restructured its debts once under Hamilton's direction, would not find ready buyers in Amsterdam or London at acceptable rates. What was required was a guarantor, an institution whose endorsement would transform speculative American paper into gilt-edged securities that European investors would purchase with confidence. What was required, in short, was Baring Brothers. The exquisite irony of the situation was lost on no one involved in the negotiations. Britain and France were already drifting toward the resumption of hostilities that would shortly produce the Napoleonic Wars, that epic confrontation that would convulse Europe for more than a decade. British policy was dedicated to containing French power and preventing Napoleon's domination of the continent. Yet here was Britain's most prestigious banking house preparing to provide the financial mechanism through which Napoleon would realize $15 million from the sale of territory that would immensely strengthen Britain's principal commercial rival in the Americas. The Foreign Office was not consulted. The Cabinet was not informed. The transaction proceeded in the twilight realm, where private banking and public policy intersected, a realm in which the House of Baring possessed a freedom of action that governments might envy. The neutrality of capital, that remarkable fiction that allowed money to flow across borders even as armies massed and fleets deployed, was never more perfectly demonstrated than in this transaction. Francis Baring, by now in his 60s and at the height of his influence, understood that the profits from arranging the Louisiana Purchase would be substantial, but more importantly, the transaction would establish Baring Brothers as the indispensable intermediary between American ambition and European capital, a position worth far more than any single commission. The mechanics of the transaction were labyrinthine. The United States would issue bonds with interest paid in London, denominated in sterling and backed by import duties collected at American ports. Baring Brothers, in consortium with Hope and Company of Amsterdam, would purchase these bonds at a substantial discount, assuming the risk that investors might not materialize. The bonds would then be sold to investors across Europe, particularly in Britain and the Netherlands, where appetite for securities yielding 6% was strong among the rentier class seeking safe returns in an era of military uncertainty. The difference between the purchase price and the sale price, plus various fees and commissions, would constitute the profit. But the real genius of the arrangement lay in its structure. By denominating the bonds in sterling and making them payable in London, Baring effectively transformed American sovereign debt into an instrument indistinguishable from British government securities in all but name. European investors were not being asked to speculate on the durability of a Republican experiment. They were being offered bonds guaranteed by a house whose word was as good as the Bank of England's. The transaction closed in the autumn of 1803, and the Louisiana Territory passed from French to American sovereignty, financed by British and Dutch capital, arranged by merchant bankers who demonstrated that in the new world of international finance, national allegiance was negotiable, but credit was absolute. This was merely the beginning of what would become, over the subsequent decades, the comprehensive financialization of American development by European capital. The United States in the early 19th century was a paradox that confounded European observers. A nation of seemingly limitless resources and negligible capital, a continental empire in the making that could not finance its own expansion. The generation of Americans who came of age after the War of 1812 dreamed vast dreams of internal improvements, of canals that would connect the Great Lakes to the Atlantic seaboard, of roads that would pierce the Appalachian barrier, of cities that would rival London and Paris in splendor and commerce. But dreams required capital, and capital required interest, and interest could only be paid from revenues that would not materialize for years or decades. State governments issued bonds to finance canal construction. Municipal governments borrowed to build waterworks and gaslight systems. Railroad companies, those emblems of 19th century modernity, required capital in such quantities that no domestic source could satisfy their appetites. All of this paper, these promises to pay 6% or 7% or 8% on funds borrowed to construct a civilization from wilderness, flowed across the Atlantic to the counting houses of London, where Baring Brothers maintained the largest and most sophisticated American department of any European banking house. The scale of British investment in American development during the 3 decades before the Civil War was staggering, amounting to hundreds of millions of pounds, sums that dwarfed Britain's investment in its own colonial possessions. Pennsylvania borrowed to build canals. New York issued bonds for the Erie Canal, that engineering marvel that made the city the commercial capital of North America. Ohio and Indiana and Illinois borrowed to construct transportation infrastructure. Cotton factors in New Orleans and Mobile operated on credit extended through London. Cotton itself, the fiber that drove both southern prosperity and northern industrial development, moved through a credit system whose ultimate source was British capital. In a very real sense, the United States was conducting a leveraged buyout of a continent using other people's money, and those other people were, more often than not, British and Dutch investors who would never see the prairies being broken or the forests being cleared, but who received their semi-annual coupons with the regularity that made such investments attractive. Baring Brothers stood at the center of this vast circulatory system, pumping European capital into American development and extracting interest payments that flowed back across the Atlantic. The partners traveled regularly to America, inspecting canals and interviewing railroad presidents, assessing the likelihood that the optimistic projections of American entrepreneurs bore some relationship to reality. They maintained extensive correspondence with American banking houses, with state treasurers, with anyone who might provide intelligence on the creditworthiness of borrowers. They learned to distinguish between states that took their obligations seriously and those that did not, between railroad projects that might actually generate sufficient revenue to service debt, and those that were elaborate frauds designed to separate European investors from their money. The risks were considerable and occasionally catastrophic. The Panic of 1837, triggered by speculative excess and the contraction of credit, resulted in widespread default on state bonds. Several American states simply repudiated their debts, declaring that their citizens would not be taxed to pay foreign creditors. Mississippi, Florida, Arkansas, and Michigan walked away from tens of millions of dollars in obligations, and there was nothing that British creditors could do beyond protest. The British government would not dispatch gunboats to collect debts from American states. The losses to Baring Brothers and other London houses were severe, and British investors developed a wariness of American securities that would persist for years. Yet even these disasters did not fundamentally alter the relationship. Capital continued to flow because the returns, when borrowers honored their commitments, were too attractive to resist, and because the long-term trajectory of American development, whatever the periodic crises, seemed inexorable. The merchant bankers of London understood what American politicians sometimes denied, that the United States was being built on British capital, that every mile of railroad track and every lock on every canal represented European savings transformed into American infrastructure, and that this relationship, however much it might be resented by American nationalists, was mutually profitable. The Americans received capital they could not generate domestically. The British received returns unavailable from domestic investment. The House of Baring collected fees at both ends of the transaction. While Baring Brothers consolidated its position as the dominant force in American finance, another family, following a parallel trajectory but carving out a distinct sphere of influence, was establishing itself as the merchant banking house for the northern reaches of Europe. The Hambros, like the Barings, were not English by origin, but had achieved through calculation and persistence a position in London finance that made their origins increasingly irrelevant. The family traced its roots to Copenhagen, where Joachim Hambro had established himself as a merchant banker of considerable ability in the late 18th century. His son, Carl Joachim Hambro, possessed the vision to recognize that Copenhagen, for all its charms and commercial significance, was a provincial capital compared to London, and that the opportunities available to a banking house based in the City of London exceeded anything possible in Scandinavia. In 1839, Carl Joachim relocated permanently to London, establishing C.J. Hambro and Son in a substantial building near the Bank of England, and set about constructing a network of relationships that would make Hambro synonymous with Northern European finance. The Hambros' strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than compete directly with established houses like Baring Brothers and Rothschild for the most prestigious sovereign accounts, they would specialize in Scandinavian and Northern European business, becoming the indispensable intermediary between London capital markets and the governments of Sweden, Norway and Denmark. These were nations whose credit was generally sound, but whose borrowing needs were too modest to attract the sustained attention of the largest houses. The Hambros cultivated relationships with finance ministers in Stockholm and Christiania, learned the intricacies of Scandinavian politics and economics, and positioned themselves as the experts to whom London investors should turn when considering northern securities. The strategy proved remarkably successful. Swedish railway bonds, Danish municipal issues, Norwegian shipping finance, all passed through the offices of C.J. Hambro and Son. The firm also developed a substantial trade finance business, providing the credit that enabled the export of timber from Scandinavia, iron from Sweden, and fish from Norway to British markets. Like the Barings before them, the Hambros understood that specialization created defensible competitive advantages, that deep knowledge of particular markets and relationships with specific governments were worth more than superficial involvement in numerous sectors. The lifestyle that accompanied success in merchant banking was distinctive, representing a careful calibration between commercial origins and aristocratic aspirations. The great banking families of mid-19th century London occupied an ambiguous social position, possessing wealth that exceeded that of most of the titled nobility, but bearing the stigma of having earned rather than inherited their fortunes. The transition from the counting house to the country estate, from trade to title, required navigation of social complexities that were never explicitly articulated, but were nonetheless rigid. The Barings managed this transition with their characteristic discretion and patience. They purchased not merely country houses, but estates of sufficient size and historical significance to impress, yet not so grand as to suggest presumption. Stratton Park in Hampshire, acquired by the second generation, was a Palladian mansion set in thousands of acres of park and farmland, the sort of property that proclaimed its owner's status without vulgarity. The family collected art, not with the aggressive comprehensiveness of the Rothschilds, but with the selective discrimination of connoisseurs. They patronized architects like Charles Barry, who would later design the Houses of Parliament, to construct or improve their properties. Their London residences in Mayfair were substantial, but not ostentatious, townhouses that might have belonged to dukes, but announced nothing from their exteriors. The daily rhythm of life for a partner in one of the great merchant banking houses combined elements of commercial discipline and leisured refinement in proportions carefully calculated to demonstrate that one had transcended trade while remaining engaged in it. The morning began early, with arrival at the office by 9 o'clock, sometimes earlier when European markets required attention. The partners maintained private rooms panelled in dark wood, where light came from gas lamps, even on sunny days, because the windows were kept curtained against the street's observation. Here, correspondence was reviewed, market intelligence assessed, decisions made about which securities to purchase or sell, which loans to extend or decline. The work required intense concentration and quick calculation, the ability to evaluate risk and opportunity with information that was always incomplete and often contradictory. Yet by early afternoon, the most urgent business concluded, a partner might retire to his club, where in the smoking room or the library, surrounded by other men of similar station, the informal conversations that actually governed the city transpired. Here ministers were encountered as if by chance, and American railway securities might be discussed over whiskey and soda. Here the intelligence that could not be committed to paper was exchanged, the early warnings of financial distress or political instability that allowed the informed to protect themselves while the uninformed suffered losses. The clubs, White's, Brooks's, the Carlton, were not merely social institutions, but essential components of the information network that made merchant banking possible. The country estate served multiple functions, operating simultaneously as agricultural enterprise, social stage, and investment in dynastic continuity. The Hambros, following the Barings template, acquired substantial properties as soon as resources permitted. Milton Abbey in Dorset, an extraordinary property that included a Gothic abbey church and hundreds of acres, became the Hambro family seat, a place where they could entertain on a scale that announced their arrival among the elite. These properties were worked by tenants who paid rent and employed labourers who lived in cottages owned by the estate. The economics were rarely favourable in purely financial terms. The returns on agricultural land could not compare with returns available from investment in securities or commercial ventures. But the calculation was not merely economic. Land conferred status in a way that no quantity of movable wealth could match. It rooted a family in English soil, provided constituencies from which parliamentary seats might be pursued, and created the physical infrastructure for the elaborate social rituals that bound the upper classes together. The shooting parties in autumn, when carefully curated groups of gentlemen would spend days murdering birds with the assistance of small armies of beaters and loaders, were not merely sport, but theatre, performances of status that reinforced hierarchies and cemented relationships. The house parties that extended over weeks during the summer months, when families would visit one another's estates with retinues of servants and trunks of formal attire, created the contexts in which marriages were arranged and commercial alliances discussed in settings far removed from the suspect atmosphere of the counting house. The transformation of merchant bankers into aristocrats, a process that unfolded across 2 or 3 generations, was never quite complete, nor did the families themselves necessarily desire completion. There remained an awareness, sometimes unspoken but always present, that their position rested ultimately on continued commercial success rather than inherited privilege. The partner in a merchant banking house could not afford the genteel indolence that was both the privilege and the curse of the landed aristocracy. He was expected to maintain his engagement with the firm, to contribute his judgment and industry to its continued prosperity. The counting house might be staffed by clerks and managed by subordinates, but the critical decisions, the approval of major loans and the assessment of sovereign creditworthiness remained with the partners. This created a hybrid identity, a class of men who lived like aristocrats but thought like merchants, who could discuss the novels of Trollope and the paintings of Turner, but whose real passion was reserved for the differentials in bond yields between Swedish and Danish government securities. Their sons were educated at public schools and ancient universities, learning Latin and Greek, and emerging with accents and attitudes indistinguishable from those of the hereditary elite. Yet they would be expected, in their turn, to enter the family firm, to spend years learning the intricacies of merchant banking before assuming partnerships and perpetuating the dynasty. The merchant princes were creating something genuinely new, a commercial aristocracy that combined the wealth-generating capacity of capitalism with the social mechanisms and aesthetic sensibilities of the traditional elite, a fusion that would come to characterize the British upper classes for the remainder of the 19th century and beyond. The seeds of catastrophe were planted in optimism, as they so often are in the history of finance. Argentina in the 1880s appeared to men sitting in London offices as a land of limitless possibility, a temperate zone replica of the United States, where European immigrants were transforming grasslands into productive farms, and where the appetite for British capital seemed insatiable. The pampas stretched empty and fertile under endless skies. Buenos Aires was growing with the manic energy of Chicago or Melbourne, those other cities of the 19th century periphery where fortunes could be made in months and lost just as quickly. British investors had poured money into Argentine railways, into port facilities at Buenos Aires and Rosario, into waterworks and gasworks and tramway companies. The Argentine government borrowed enthusiastically to finance infrastructure and to cover budget deficits that seemed temporary inconveniences rather than structural problems. The returns were magnificent, yields of 8% or 9% on bonds backed by what everyone assured everyone else was the next great commodity exporter. And Baring Brothers, which had dabbled cautiously in Argentine finance for decades, decided in the mid-1880s to abandon caution entirely. The decision was driven by competition and ambition in roughly equal measure. The firm had watched as other London houses, most notably the Rothschilds, captured increasingly lucrative business arranging loans for European governments. The American market, once so promising, had become treacherous after the widespread state defaults of earlier decades, and in any case was now served by an increasingly sophisticated domestic banking system that reduced dependence on London capital. Argentina represented an opportunity to dominate a major sovereign account, to establish the sort of relationship that had made the firm's reputation in the first century of its existence. The Argentine government, for its part, was delighted to find a banking house of Baring's prestige willing to underwrite ever larger bond issues. The arrangement was mutually flattering and ultimately ruinous. Baring Brothers moved from being a cautious arranger of Argentine securities, carefully placing bonds with investors and collecting fees, to becoming a principal, purchasing enormous quantities of Argentine bonds directly and holding them on the firm's books while seeking buyers. This was a fundamental violation of merchant banking prudence. The role of the merchant banker was to intermediate, to connect borrowers with lenders, and to profit from the connection, not to become a lender on one's own account. But the profits from holding securities during the interval between purchase and sale were too attractive, and the confidence that buyers would materialize was too strong. Edward Baring, who had become Lord Revelstoke and senior partner, was a man of considerable ability and even greater assurance. He had guided the firm through decades of profitable growth. He saw no reason to doubt that Argentina's trajectory would continue upward, that the bonds he was accumulating would be absorbed by the market in due course. The warning signs were visible to anyone willing to see them, which is to say they were visible to almost no one directly involved in the transactions. The Argentine government's finances were chaotic, revenues consistently falling short of expenditures, the deficit covered by borrowing that would itself require refinancing. The country's export earnings, derived almost entirely from agricultural commodities, were subject to the volatility of world markets and the weather. A revolution or a drought could derail the entire edifice. But these concerns seemed abstract when measured against the concrete reality of yields that exceeded anything available from British consols or German bunds. Through 1888 and 1889, Baring Brothers underwrote Argentine bond issues totaling tens of millions of pounds. The firm purchased the bonds at a discount, typically 85 or 90% of face value, and planned to sell them to investors at 95 or par. The difference, multiplied across the vast quantities involved, would generate profits measured in millions. Except the investors never came, or came in numbers insufficient to absorb the inventory. The market for Argentine securities, which had seemed bottomless, suddenly revealed itself to be shallow and fickle. Political instability in Buenos Aires, a decline in commodity prices, whispers about the sustainability of Argentine finances, all contributed to investor reluctance. But the fundamental problem was simpler. Baring Brothers had accumulated more Argentine bonds than the market could possibly absorb at the prices the firm required to remain solvent. By the summer of 1890, the position had become untenable. The firm held Argentine securities with a face value exceeding £40 million, purchased with money borrowed from other banks on the assumption that the securities would be quickly sold. But the securities were not selling, and the money borrowed to purchase them was coming due. The mechanics of the crisis were numbingly technical, but the implications were existential. Baring Brothers had liabilities that would mature in weeks, and assets that could not be converted to cash, except at prices that would realize catastrophic losses. The firm was illiquid and heading rapidly toward insolvency. The partners understood this. What they did not understand, what they could not have understood given the opacity of 19th century finance, was that their crisis would not remain private. In previous eras, when banking was conducted among a small circle of known quantities, a firm facing temporary liquidity problems might arrange discreet support from correspondents and work through difficulties without public awareness. But the scale of Baring's exposure and the number of institutions that had extended credit to the firm made secrecy impossible. By early November, rumors were circulating in the city. Baring Brothers was in difficulties. The nature and extent of those difficulties remained unclear, but uncertainty proved sufficient to trigger panic. The psychology of financial panic is distinctive and terrible. It operates at a velocity that makes reasoned response nearly impossible. On November 7th, Lord Revelstoke met privately with William Lidderdale, the Governor of the Bank of England, and confessed the situation. The numbers were staggering. Baring Brothers required £21 million immediately to meet liabilities coming due. The firm's assets, if liquidated in an orderly fashion over months or years, might eventually cover these liabilities, but there was no time for orderly liquidation. Without immediate assistance, the firm would fail within days. Lidderdale understood instantly that this was not merely a problem for the Baring family. A failure of Baring Brothers would destroy confidence in the entire London financial system. Banks that had extended credit to Baring would suffer losses. Investors who held securities underwritten by Baring would panic. The contagion would spread through the interconnected web of credit that constituted modern finance, and institutions far removed from Argentine speculation would collapse for no reason other than their misfortune to be operating at the moment. Confidence evaporated. The phrase used later was systemic risk, but in November 1890 they had no such terminology. They knew only that catastrophe was imminent. The following days unfolded with the compressed intensity of a fever dream. Lidderdale moved with decisive speed, understanding that hesitation would be fatal. He could not save Baring Brothers using only the Bank of England's resources without exposing the bank itself to unacceptable risk. What was required was a consortium, a joint effort by the major banking houses of London to provide the credit necessary to prevent Barings' collapse. But assembling such a consortium required convincing intensely competitive institutions to cooperate in rescuing a rival, and doing so in absolute secrecy before rumour became public knowledge and triggered the very panic they sought to prevent. On the evening of November 13th, Lidderdale summoned representatives of the major London banks and merchant houses to a meeting at the Bank of England. The location was deliberately chosen, the Old Lady of Threadneedle Street, whose granite walls and classical columns embodied the permanence of British finance. If catastrophe could be averted anywhere, it would be here, in the courtroom where so many crises had been managed before. They gathered after dark. The meeting was not announced. The participants arrived separately, using side entrances, avoiding the notice of clerks or journalists. In the courtroom, gas lamps cast shadows across portraits of former governors whose painted eyes seemed to observe the proceedings with skepticism. Lidderdale explained the situation with brutal clarity. Baring Brothers was insolvent. The firm required a guarantee fund of £21 million to prevent immediate collapse. If the firm failed, the consequences would exceed anything London had experienced since the Panic of 1825. Banks would fail. The discount market would freeze. British credit, the foundation of the nation's commercial supremacy, would be gravely damaged. He proposed that the Bank of England would contribute £1 million if the assembled houses would collectively provide the remainder. There was silence. £1 million was an enormous sum to ask of institutions that competed ferociously for business and had no particular affection for the Barings. But the alternative was unthinkable. The Rothschilds were present, represented by Nathaniel Rothschild, and his response would determine the outcome. The Rothschilds and the Barings had been rivals for 3/4 of a century, competing for the same sovereign accounts, bidding against each other for major issues, maintaining a relationship of cool professional courtesy that barely masked mutual disdain. The Rothschilds had been skeptical of Argentine securities, had declined to participate in the speculations that had brought Baring to ruin, and might have been forgiven for experiencing some satisfaction at seeing their great rival brought low. Instead, Nathaniel Rothschild immediately pledged £1 million to the guarantee fund. The gesture was extraordinary, a demonstration that the Rothschilds understood what some of the British houses, blinded by narrower concerns, apparently did not, that a failure of Baring Brothers would damage them all, that the stability of the London market was more important than competitive advantage. With the Rothschilds committed, the other houses had little choice. To refuse would be to mark themselves as unreliable in crisis, as institutions that placed self-interest above systemic stability. Within hours, commitments totaling more than £17 million had been secured, but the real drama was still to come. The guarantee fund would prevent Baring Brothers from declaring bankruptcy, but it could not restore the firm's reputation or preserve its independence. The partnership would have to be dissolved and restructured as a limited liability company, a humiliation that transformed the family firm into just another corporation. The partners would lose their unlimited personal wealth, their country houses and art collections potentially forfeit to creditors. Lord Revelstoke, the man who had presided over the firm's expansion into catastrophe, would have to resign. The family's century of accumulated prestige, the aura of infallibility that had made Baring the establishment bank, was shattered in a fortnight. The news could not be contained indefinitely. By mid-November, word had spread throughout the city. Baring was finished. The details remained unclear, but the essence was unmistakable. The sixth great power of Europe had collapsed, saved from utter ruin only by the intervention of rivals and the Bank of England. The psychological impact on the family was profound and permanent. They had not merely failed, they had failed spectacularly, publicly, in a manner that exposed the hubris underlying their decades of success. The Barings had believed themselves immune to the errors that destroyed lesser houses. They had confused a long run of successful decisions with infallibility. They had mistaken reputation for substance, convinced that their name alone would guarantee investor confidence regardless of the underlying quality of securities they underwrote. Argentina had revealed these beliefs as delusions. No name, however prestigious, could make bad securities good. No reputation, however carefully cultivated, could survive exposure of fundamental incompetence. The family members not directly involved in the firm's management experienced a different but equally painful humiliation. They had lived as aristocrats, had married into the peerage, had assumed that their position was secured by more than mere commercial success. Now they discovered that the foundation was fragile, that everything could be lost, that they were ultimately dependent on the continued tolerance of rivals who had no obligation to rescue them. The restructured firm, Baring Brothers and Company Limited, would survive and eventually prosper again, but it would never recapture the absolute dominance it had enjoyed before 1890. The crisis had revealed that even the greatest financial dynasties were only as strong as their next payment, only as solvent as their most recent gamble. The lesson should have been learned by every banking house in London, inscribed above the entrance to every counting house. Leverage is a sword that cuts both ways, and confidence once lost is almost impossible to fully restore. But lessons in finance are always forgotten, usually within a single generation, because the profits from taking risk are immediate and tangible, while the consequences of failure seem both distant and improbable. The clerks and junior partners who witnessed the Baring crisis would themselves become senior partners in time, and they would make their own errors, pursue their own speculations, convince themselves that this time was different, that they were smarter than their predecessors, that the warning signs everyone else saw were merely the concerns of timid men who lacked vision. In the immediate aftermath, as winter settled over London and the city struggled to absorb what had occurred, there was much discussion of how the crisis might have been prevented, of what regulations might be imposed to ensure such catastrophes never recurred. But these discussions led nowhere because the fundamental problem was not susceptible to regulatory solution. The problem was human nature, the eternal temptation to confuse a rising market with genius, to mistake luck for skill, to believe that the rules applying to ordinary institutions somehow did not apply to firms of exceptional prestige. The Barings had gambled with other people's money and lost, and had been saved only because their collapse would have taken innocent parties down with them. This fact, that they were too important to be allowed to fail, created what later generations would call moral hazard, the knowledge that institutions of sufficient size and interconnection could socialize their losses while privatizing their gains. But in 1890, they had no such terminology. They knew only that something had gone terribly wrong, that one of the pillars supporting the edifice of British finance had proven hollow, and that the edifice itself had trembled but not fallen. The Argentine bonds that had caused the crisis eventually recovered some value. The guarantee fund was never fully drawn. The institutions that had pledged support were not required to make good on their entire commitments. Baring Brothers, reconstituted and chastened, would continue to operate for another century. But the mythology was broken. The family would never again be spoken of with the reverence that had attached to their name before November 1890. They remained wealthy, influential, connected to the highest levels of British society and government. But they were no longer untouchable, no longer the sixth great power. They were simply another banking house, distinguished by history but not immune to failure. The lesson was as old as finance itself. Reputation is built over generations but can be destroyed in days, and the distance between solvency and ruin is always shorter than it appears. The 20th century was not kind to the merchant princes. The world that had allowed families like the Barings and the Hambros to flourish, that peculiar Victorian arrangement where private banking houses could operate with the discretion and influence of sovereign states, was dismantled piece by world wars, regulatory regimes, and the democratization of capital markets. The First World War destroyed the illusion that commercial relationships transcended national boundaries, that money could flow freely regardless of political allegiance. British banks with German correspondents found those relationships severed overnight. The Bolshevik Revolution repudiated Russian debts, wiping out investments that had been considered secure. The interwar period brought instability and depression. The Second World War completed the process, subordinating all economic activity to national survival. By 1945, the landscape of international finance had been fundamentally transformed. The great merchant banking houses remained, but they operated in a constrained environment, subject to currency controls and capital restrictions. Their freedom of action circumscribed by governments that had learned during wartime the utility of directing economic activity towards state purposes. The Hambros navigated this transformed world with the same cautious intelligence that had characterized their operations in the 19th century. They remained smaller than the great universal banks that were emerging, more specialized, focused on particular sectors and geographies where their expertise provided competitive advantage. Scandinavian finance remained core to their identity. When Swedish companies sought to acquire British firms, when Norwegian shipping magnates required financing, when Danish pension funds wanted exposure to British equities, Hambro Bank was the institution they consulted. The family also cultivated relationships with British industrial concerns, providing advice on mergers and capital structure, acting as trusted counselors to management teams that valued discretion above the aggressive salesmanship of newer, hungrier institutions. They survived because they never forgot what they were: a family firm whose reputation was its principal asset, and whose longevity depended on avoiding the catastrophic errors that destroyed larger, more ambitious competitors. Through the turbulent decades of the mid-20th century, through the collapse of Bretton Woods and the oil shocks of the 1970s, through the Big Bang deregulation of the 1980s that transformed the City of London into something almost unrecognizable from the gentleman's club it had been, Hambro Bank persisted, adapting without abandoning the conservative principles that had sustained the family through 5 generations. Baring Brothers also survived the restructuring of 1890 and continued operations through the 20th century, though the absolute dominance it had once enjoyed never returned. The firm rebuilt its capital base, restructured its partnerships, and returned to profitability, but always with the knowledge that catastrophe was possible, that even the most prestigious institutions could fail. This knowledge should have instilled permanent caution. For a century, it seemed to have done so. The firm avoided the speculative excess that destroyed other houses during the 1920s. It navigated the Depression without major losses. It emerged from the Second World War positioned to participate in the reconstruction of international finance. By the 1980s, Baring Brothers had evolved into Barings Bank, a diversified financial institution with securities trading operations in London and Asia, asset management divisions, and corporate finance advisory services. The family retained significant ownership, but operational control had passed to professional managers. It was a respectable upper-tier institution, not the dominant force it had once been, but solid, profitable, and carrying a name that still resonated with history. No one imagined that within 5 years it would cease to exist, destroyed not by sovereign default or market collapse, but by the actions of a single trader in a Singapore office, whom the senior management in London barely knew existed. Nicholas Leeson arrived in Singapore in 1992 as a settlement clerk, back-office staff responsible for ensuring that trades executed by Barings traders were properly recorded and settled. He was 25 years old, the son of a plasterer, educated at comprehensive schools, decidedly not the sort of person who would have been hired by Baring Brothers in its 19th century incarnation. But this was modern banking, where mathematical ability and computer literacy mattered more than family connections, where meritocracy competed with class as an organizing principle. Leeson proved capable and ambitious. Within a year he had been promoted to trading floor manager and authorized to conduct arbitrage trades, exploiting small price differences between futures contracts traded in Singapore and Osaka. This was supposed to be a low-risk activity, buying in one market while simultaneously selling in another, capturing the spread with minimal directional exposure. The profits were modest but certain, the sort of steady business that suited a bank like Barings, which still thought of itself as conservative despite having expanded aggressively into securities trading without fully understanding the risks involved. What happened next was banal in its mechanics and catastrophic in its consequences. Leeson began making unauthorized speculative trades, betting enormous sums on the direction of Japanese stock market futures. When these trades lost money, rather than reporting the losses, he concealed them in a hidden error account numbered 888858, because 8 was considered a lucky number in Chinese culture. The account had been established legitimately to record trading errors, but Leeson repurposed it to hide his mounting losses. He then attempted to trade his way out of the hole, making ever larger bets that the Nikkei index would rise. Each loss was concealed in account 888888. Each subsequent bet was sized to recover not just the most recent loss, but all accumulated losses. This was the classic gambler's fallacy translated into institutional trading, the belief that the next bet will reverse fortune, that persistence will eventually yield the winning position that justifies all previous losses. The positions grew to absurd size, representing billions of pounds of exposure on behalf of a bank whose total capital was less than £500 million. Senior management in London were not merely unaware of the unauthorized trading. They actively believed that Leeson was one of their most profitable traders, generating returns that seemed too good to be true because they were too good to be true. The structure that allowed this catastrophe revealed how thoroughly the mechanisms of modern finance had diverged from the careful personal oversight that had characterized merchant banking in its classical form. In the 19th century, every significant transaction was reviewed by partners who understood counterparty risk and market exposure, who knew their clients personally and assessed creditworthiness through direct observation as much as through analysis of accounts. By the 1990s, trading occurred at electronic speed across global markets. Positions were recorded in computer systems that senior management struggled to interpret, and risk controls depended on segregation of duties that were routinely violated. Leeson was supposed to be supervised by separate staff responsible for settlements and risk management, but in the small Singapore office he effectively supervised himself, reporting fictional profits to London while the hidden account accumulated real losses. The very innovations that had made modern banking profitable, the ability to execute thousands of trades daily across multiple markets with minimal human intervention, had created opacity that made fraud not merely possible, but almost inevitable. The collapse came in January 1995 when an earthquake struck Kobe, causing the Nikkei to decline sharply. Leeson's massive long positions, his bets that the market would rise, instantly accumulated losses that exceeded Barings' entire capital. There was no concealing this. The positions were too large, the losses too catastrophic. On February 23rd, Leeson abandoned his desk, fled Singapore with his wife, and left behind a note apologizing for the disaster. When Barings' management in London finally examined the Singapore books and discovered account 8888, they confronted losses exceeding £800 million. The bank was insolvent. Unlike 1890, there would be no rescue. The Bank of England, under different leadership and operating in a different regulatory environment, declined to organize a bailout. The consensus was that Barings was not systemically important, that its failure would not trigger cascading collapses across the financial system, and that shareholders and management should bear the consequences of inadequate risk controls. Over a frantic weekend, attempts were made to find a buyer, but no institution was willing to acquire Barings with its massive liabilities. Finally, ING, a Dutch banking and insurance conglomerate, agreed to purchase Barings for the nominal sum of £1, assuming its liabilities in exchange for its client base and remaining assets, £1. The bank that had financed the Louisiana Purchase, that had been described as the sixth great power of Europe, that had survived and prospered through the Napoleonic Wars and the Victorian era and 2 world wars, was sold for the price of a newspaper. The humiliation was total and absolute. The Baring family, those members who retained shares in the restructured bank, lost everything. The employees, thousands of them across global offices, learned of the collapse through news reports. The clients, some of whom had banked with Barings for generations, were transferred to ING's control. The name survived for a few years as a subsidiary brand, then was quietly retired. By the turn of the millennium, Barings existed only as a footnote in financial history, a case study taught in business schools as an example of operational risk and management failure. The mechanics of the collapse were modern, but the underlying dynamic was ancient. Leeson had used leverage, that fundamental tool of banking, to make bets far exceeding the capital backing them. This was precisely what Baring Brothers had done in 1890 with Argentine bonds, using borrowed money to purchase securities they could not sell, accumulating exposure that exceeded their ability to absorb losses. The technology had changed, the speed had accelerated, but the essential error remained constant. The confusion of temporary success with permanent ability, the belief that risk could be managed through sophistication rather than through restraint. The hidden account, numbered 88888, was simply the electronic equivalent of the drawer, where earlier generations of traders had concealed losing positions, hoping that time and luck would vindicate their decisions. The catastrophe revealed that all the advances in financial theory, all the computer systems and risk management frameworks could not eliminate the human capacity for self-deception and the institutional tendency to reward apparent profits without investigating their source. The broader lesson extended beyond Barings to encompass the entire history of the merchant princes. The families that had accumulated such wealth and influence during the 19th century had done so by mastering the mechanisms of credit, by understanding that lending to nations and financing trade could generate returns that dwarfed anything available from conventional commerce. But credit is a two-edged instrument. The same tools that build empires can destroy them if discipline is lost, if the temptation to extend just a bit further, to take just slightly more risk in pursuit of just marginally higher returns, overwhelms the caution that should govern institutions entrusted with other people's money. The manuscript of power that the Barings and Hambros had written in the 19th century, that elaborate code of practices and relationships that had allowed merchant banks to function as the hidden architecture of empire, contained within itself the seeds of destruction. The very success of the system encouraged excess. The long periods of stability and profitability convinced each new generation that they were immune to the errors that had destroyed their predecessors, until they weren't. The ghosts that haunt the ruins of Barings are digital now, traces in archived computer systems, records of trades that should never have been executed, risk reports that were never read. The fog that once shrouded Lombard Street has been replaced by the electronic fog of high-frequency trading, where positions are held for milliseconds and where human judgment has been largely displaced by algorithms. But the game continues. The names have changed, Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan instead of Baring and Rothschild, but the essential dynamic persists. Institutions accumulate capital and deploy leverage. They take risks that are not fully understood by those authorizing them. They operate in markets that are interconnected and opaque, and periodically, with predictable regularity, they fail, sometimes spectacularly, sometimes bringing down other institutions in their collapse. The regulators respond with new rules and requirements. The banks adapt and find new ways to take risk. The cycle repeats because the fundamental incentives have not changed. The profits from successful risk-taking accrue to individuals and institutions. The losses from failed bets are socialized, absorbed by taxpayers or by the erosion of public confidence in financial systems. What remains of the Hambros and the Barings? Hambro Bank was eventually acquired by Société Générale in 1998. Another name absorbed into a larger institution and gradually effaced. The country houses still exist, occupied now by different families or converted to hotels and conference centers. The art collections were dispersed through estate sales. The partnerships were dissolved. But the idea persists, the notion that there exists a class of institutions and individuals who understand the hidden mechanisms of capital, who can move money across borders and time, who can transform the promises of nations into tradable instruments. They operate now from offices in Manhattan and Hong Kong as much as London. They serve sovereign wealth funds and pension plans instead of individual aristocrats. They structure derivatives instead of underwriting bond issues. But they are recognizably the descendants of the merchant princes, pursuing the same essential business of intermediation and leverage that Francis Baring would have understood, even if the specific instruments would have baffled him. The final lesson inscribed in the ruins of these dynasties is uncomfortable and universal. No institution is permanent. No reputation is unassailable. No family is immune to the forces of competition and technological change that constantly remake the landscape of finance. The Barings lasted 2¼ centuries from founding to final collapse, a remarkable run by any standard, but ultimately not remarkable enough. They survived wars and revolutions and depressions, only to be destroyed by a combination of hubris and inadequate oversight in an era when they should have been most cautious. The manuscript of their success became the script of their destruction. The same credit mechanisms they had pioneered, the same global reach they had cultivated, the same reputation for sophistication that had made them dominant, created the conditions for catastrophic failure. And so it ends, as all such stories eventually end, not with a dramatic climax, but with administrative proceedings, with assets transferred and debts settled, with a name that once commanded deference becoming merely a memory, another reminder that in the annals of high finance, the only certainty is eventual collapse, and the only question is when.